The battered sign creaked in the wind, its faded letters barely spelling out Blackwood Motel. Even from the road, the place exuded an aura of decay, a palpable sense of wrongness that prickled at the edges of our excitement. We'd driven for hours, fueled by cheap gas station coffee and the reckless thrill of urban legends, finally arriving at the infamous Blackwood Motel, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a roadside purgatory clinging to the edge of nowhere. The air hung heavy, thick with the cloying sweetness of decay and the damp chill of 1,000 forgotten nights. A rusted chain dangled loosely across the entrance, a pathetic attempt to deter trespassers. Mark, ever the pragmatist, easily shrugged it aside, a smirk playing on his lips. "Come on, scaredy cats," he scoffed, pushing open the creaking gate. His bravado felt thin, brittle, against the oppressive silence of the night. The neon sign above the office flickered intermittently, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like restless spirits. Broken panes of glass in the windows were like vacant eyes staring out into the darkness, each one a silent scream in the otherwise deathly stillness. A chilling wind whistled through the gaps, carrying with it the scent of mildew and something else, something acrid and unsettling that clung to the back of my throat. It was the smell of fear, of death, of a history soaked in blood and sorrow. Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "This place, it's creepy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mournful sigh of the wind. Ben, our self-proclaimed skeptic, scoffed again. "It's just an old motel, Emily. A bit run down, maybe, but nothing to be afraid of." His words were unconvincing, even to him. A tremor of unease ran through his forced confidence, a betrayal hidden beneath a veneer of bravado. Chloe, our resident sensitive soul, remained silent, her gaze fixed on the darkened windows. She was always the first to sense things, the first to feel the shift in atmosphere, the subtle changes that went unnoticed by the rest of us. A wave of nausea rolled over her, and she subtly placed a hand over her mouth, her face pale. Even in the dim light, I could see the apprehension growing in her large dark eyes. It wasn't just the decaying state of the motel, it was something far more profound, something ancient and malevolent. We cautiously entered the main building, the heavy wooden door groaning in protest under Mark's forceful push. The interior was a symphony of decay. Peeling wallpaper hung in tattered strips, revealing layers of discolored plaster beneath. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and dust, a suffocating silence broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deep within the building's bowels. The floorboards groaned under our weight, each step echoing through the cavernous space. The lobby was a scene of utter desolation. A tattered armchair slumped in a corner, its stuffing spilling out like disemboweled entrails. A dusty, cracked countertop stood like a tombstone, the surface covered in a thick film of grime. Behind it, a disintegrating register lay open, its drawers empty, a testament to the long-abandoned business. The air hung heavy with the weight of forgotten years, a spectral stillness that settled on us like a shroud. The oppressive silence felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the boisterous laughter that had filled our car just moments before. The initial thrill of our adventure began to curdle into something far more sinister. It was a feeling of being watched, of being scrutinized by unseen eyes, a sense of dread that burrowed deep into our bones. We moved deeper into the motel, our footsteps hesitant, our laughter replaced by hushed whispers. The rooms were identical, small, cramped spaces filled with nothing but dust, shadows, and the lingering ghost of past occupants. Each room we entered felt colder, darker, more oppressive than the last. The silence was unnerving, a void that seemed to amplify the faintest of sounds, the creak of a loose floorboard, the whisper of the wind, the erratic thump of our own hearts. The darkness seemed to press in on us, a tangible entity that felt like a suffocating blanket. The shadows in the corners of each room pulsed and shifted, taking on grotesque shapes and forms. It was impossible to shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the edges of our vision, its presence a chilling weight in the air. As we continued our exploration, a growing sense of unease settled over us, replacing the initial thrill with a chilling fear. The decaying building itself seemed to be alive. The sounds of its decay, the creaking, groaning, and sighing, felt like the death rattle of a dying beast. It was a palpable sense of dread that was no longer confined to our imaginations, but had permeated our very being. Every shadow stretched and morphed, playing tricks on our eyes. Every creak and groan of the dilapidated structure sent shivers down our spines. The oppressive silence was punctuated only by the erratic thump of our own hearts, and the occasional unsettling whisper that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the motel. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable sense of impending horror that settled upon us like a shroud. We moved through the motel with a renewed caution, the laughter of a few hours ago now a distant memory. The oppressive atmosphere was suffocating, a chilling blanket that wrapped around us and refused to let go. Every step felt heavier, each shadow seemed to writhe and twist, feeding on our growing fear. We were no longer exploring. We were trapped in a nightmare, our own excitement now a cruel irony in the face of the stark reality of our situation. The Blackwood Motel wasn't just dilapidated, it was malevolent. It was a place where time seemed to warp, where the past bled into the present, and where the line between the living and the dead was impossibly thin. And as we ventured further into its decaying depths, we felt that line blur, our initial bravado replaced by a growing, chilling dread that promised far more than a simple ghost story. We were about to learn that the stories told about Blackwood Motel were not exaggerations, but a terrifying understatement of the horror that lay within its decaying walls. The very air itself seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy, a silent scream held captive within the rotting wood and crumbling plaster. And we were trapped deep inside with no way out. Our adventure had just begun, and it was about to take a dark, terrifying turn. The musty smell intensified as we delved deeper into the Blackwood Motel, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like a shroud. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight, filtering through the broken windows, each one a tiny, glittering phantom in the oppressive gloom. We moved from room to room, each identical to the last. Cramped, decaying spaces, the air thick with the ghosts of forgotten lives. Then tucked away in a dusty corner of one of the rooms, we found a battered suitcase. Inside, nestled among yellowed linens and moth-eaten clothing, were faded photographs and brittle newspaper clippings. The photographs depicted smiling families, their faces now obscured by the passage of time and the ravages of decay, posed awkwardly in front of the motel. Their smiles felt macabre now, distorted by the knowledge of what we were about to uncover. The newspaper clippings, painstakingly preserved, detailed a series of disappearances and unexplained deaths linked to the Blackwood Motel. Stories of travelers vanishing without a trace, their cars abandoned in the overgrown parking lot. Tales of screams heard in the dead of night, followed by an unnerving silence.
Each article painted a more terrifying picture of the motel's sinister history, a history far more gruesome than any ghost story we had anticipated. The headlines screamed of unsolved mysteries, of a darkness clinging to this forsaken place. A chilling sense of foreboding settled upon us, heavier than the dust-laden air. The initial thrill of exploration had evaporated, replaced by a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep into our very souls. Ben, our self-proclaimed skeptic, tried to maintain his composure, his bravado a thin veneer over a growing unease. He attributed the strange occurrences to natural causes, old pipes, faulty wiring, tricks of the light. But even his explanations felt hollow, unconvincing even to himself. The evidence spoke for itself. This wasn't just a rundown motel, it was something far more sinister. Emily, her face pale and drawn, found an old diary tucked away behind a loose panel in the wall. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages brittle with age. She carefully opened it, revealing spidery handwriting that detailed horrifying rituals and sacrifices, chilling accounts of dark ceremonies performed under the cover of darkness. The diary spoke of a curse, a malevolent entity tied to the land, feeding on the motel's occupants. It was a descent into madness, penned by someone trapped in the clutches of something beyond human comprehension. Words like blood sacrifice and ancient evil jumped from the page, leaving us speechless, each word a dagger to the heart. The ink, faded as it was, felt somehow fresh, imbued with a dark energy that sent shivers down our spines. The words were not just descriptions, they were whispers from the past, a haunting echo of horrific acts. The diary detailed the lives of those who had resided in the motel before, lives cut short, their final moments shrouded in unspeakable terror.
Each entry painted a more vivid picture of the malevolent presence that had overtaken the Blackwood Motel, confirming our deepest fears. We read of whispers in the dead of night, of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of rooms, of a growing sense of dread that had consumed its victims. The diary was a testament to their suffering, their desperate attempts to escape, their final, chilling pleas for help. Sarah, normally the most resilient among us, began to exhibit strange symptoms. She started experiencing vivid nightmares, waking up in cold sweats, her eyes wide with terror. The visions blurred the lines between reality and dreams, haunting images of shadowed figures and ritualistic sacrifices plaguing her sleep. During the day, she would lapse into periods of intense fear, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her usually cheerful demeanor was replaced with a deep, unsettling quiet, her silence more frightening than any scream. She spoke of fleeting images, distorted faces, and shadowed figures flickering at the edges of her vision, of a chilling presence that followed her from room to room. The visions were vivid and disturbing, leaving her emotionally drained and utterly terrified. The once vibrant Sarah was now a shell of her former self, haunted by the darkness of the Blackwood Motel. The weight of the motel's history pressed down on us, each discovery amplifying our growing fear. The decaying structure itself felt alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that seeped into our very bones. The initial excitement of our urban exploration had completely vanished, replaced by a primal terror that threatened to consume us. We were no longer just exploring a dilapidated motel. We were trapped in a nightmare, haunted by the ghosts of the past and the malevolent entity that clung to the very walls. Ben, despite his initial skepticism, couldn't deny the evidence any longer. The diary entries, the newspaper clippings, Sarah's terrifying visions, it was all too much. His attempts at rational explanations sounded increasingly hollow and desperate, his voice barely above a whisper. The skepticism that had once been his shield was now shattered, leaving him exposed to the full force of the motel's chilling power. He started seeing things too, shadowy movements in his peripheral vision, fleeting glimpses of distorted faces, whispers in the silence. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a palpable fear that mirrored our own. The line between our reality and the supernatural realm was blurring, the events unfolding before us defying any logical explanation. Each creak of the building, each flicker of the moonlight, each whispered word seemed pregnant with a malevolent energy. The shadows themselves seemed to writhe and shift, forming grotesque shapes and faces, their movements mocking our growing fear. We were trapped, surrounded by a palpable darkness that fed on our terror, a malevolent presence that reveled in our escalating fear. The air crackled with unseen energy, a tangible weight that pressed down on us, suffocating and terrifying. Our exploration had transformed into a desperate fight for survival. The casual thrill-seeking had been replaced by a horrifying reality. We were trapped in a place steeped in a dark and bloody history, a history that was now actively hunting us. The Blackwood Motel wasn't just a decaying building. It was a portal to a realm of unimaginable horror. The curse, once a mere legend whispered in hushed tones, had now become a terrifying reality. We were no longer explorers, we were prey, and the hunt had begun. The night was far from over, and the horrors we were yet to face were beyond anything we could have ever imagined. The motel itself seemed to be alive, its decay a symphony of impending doom, its silence punctuated by the chilling whispers that hinted at the unspeakable terrors lurking just beyond the reach of our sight. Our journey had become a desperate race against time, a struggle for survival against a force far older and more powerful than ourselves. Escape felt increasingly unlikely, the Blackwood curse tightening its grip, slowly crushing the hope of freedom. Our initial bravado was long gone. Now, only the desperate fight for survival remained. The silence of the Blackwood Motel was deceptive. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty building. It was a suffocating stillness, pregnant with unseen energies, punctuated only by the occasional groan of settling timbers or the whisper of wind through broken panes. We huddled together, the flickering beam of Ben's flashlight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and shift before our eyes. The weight of the motel's malevolent history pressed down on us, a tangible oppression that choked the breath from our lungs. Then, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, they grew in intensity, weaving through the oppressive silence, a chilling chorus of unseen voices. They were not words, not in any language we recognized, but a cacophony of sibilant sounds, rasping murmurs, and chilling hisses that seemed to burrow into our minds. They spoke of despair, of unimaginable terror, a symphony of dread that pierced through our defenses and burrowed into our very souls. Sarah, already shaken by her earlier visions, let out a strangled gasp, her body trembling violently. The whispers seemed to center on her, intensifying in volume and malevolence. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, darted nervously, reflecting the flickering light of Ben's flashlight, which cast an eerie glow upon her pale face. Her lips moved silently, as if she were attempting to speak, but no sound escaped her parched throat. The whispers now felt tangible, wrapping around her like icy tendrils. Ben, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline, tried to maintain his composure, his voice a shaky tremor in the oppressive silence. "It's just the wind," he stammered, his words sounding unconvincing even to himself. But the wind didn't whisper tales of dread. It howled, roared, and whistled, not with the ethereal whispers that surrounded us. His attempts at rationalization were growing thinner, weaker, as the supernatural phenomena intensified around us. The rational explanations had begun to crumble under the mounting evidence. His bravery, a shield against his initial fear, was now a thin, crumbling veil, easily ripped apart by the chilling forces surrounding us. Then, the objects started to move. A chipped teacup on a dusty dresser across the room slid silently to the edge, teetering before crashing to the floor with a sharp clatter that echoed through the unsettling silence of the motel. Another clatter followed in a different room, like a chain reaction in a macabre game. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Mark, our ever-practical member, tried to blame it on the unstable floorboards, the tremor of the aged building, but even his voice held a note of unease. The movements were deliberate, unnatural. The shadowy figures began to appear. Fleeting glimpses at the edges of our vision, amorphous shapes shifting and swirling in the darkness. They were just beyond the reach of our flashlight beam, at the periphery of our sight. A constant shifting and swirling of dark shapes at the far edges of our vision. We all saw them, dark, malevolent entities that mocked our attempts to understand, to explain. They were neither fully formed nor indistinct, existing in a twilight zone between visibility and obfuscation, teasing us with the edges of their presence. These glimpses felt like threats, taunts, warnings from the supernatural forces in the Blackwood Motel. They felt purposeful, mocking our attempts to define and understand them. Their presence only deepened our terror and enhanced the oppressive atmosphere. Chloe, always the most sensitive among us, was the first to experience a full-blown encounter. She stumbled back from a full-length mirror that had been previously innocuous, her breath caught in her throat. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, reflected the horror in her eyes. "There's someone behind me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking uncontrollably. "A woman, in the mirror. She's smiling." Slowly, hesitantly, we approached the mirror. Chloe remained frozen, staring wide-eyed, her finger pointing at a reflection that seemed to have changed. The reflection was not just Chloe. It was a superimposed image, a ghostly apparition superimposed over her own. A woman with long, dark hair that obscured her face. A subtle shimmer surrounded her, a misty aura that hinted at something non-corporeal. Her face was barely visible, obscured by the dark hair and the way that she seemed to ripple in and out of the reflection, but the faint suggestion of a grim smile was chilling. A smile that lacked warmth, a smile of pure malice. Mark, determined to hold on to his rationality, attempted a logical explanation, suggesting it was a trick of the light, a distorted reflection, anything to dismiss the terrifying image. But the eerie smile remained, the subtle shimmering around the figure persisting, a stark contrast to our very real fear. His voice trembled, even as he spoke his words. His attempt to find logical explanation crumbled in the face of the clearly supernatural occurrence. The line between logic and the supernatural was blurring in front of our eyes. There was no logic to this. The apparition in the mirror vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only Chloe's trembling form and the oppressive silence of the motel. The silence, however, was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy silence, charged with an eerie energy, a silence filled with the knowledge that we were not alone. The whispers intensified, a chorus of unseen voices surrounding us, and the chilling certainty that something malevolent was watching. Our fear was no longer an abstract idea. It was a living, breathing entity tightening its grip around us, a cold, clammy hand closing on our hearts. The events of that night escalated rapidly after Chloe's encounter. Every shadow seemed to writhe with malevolent intent, every creak of the old building a potential signal of impending doom. The whispers became clearer, less like sounds and more like thoughts implanted directly into our brains. The chilling whispers contained snippets of unsettling words, taunts, warnings, promises of things that we could not comprehend. These insidious mental assaults chipped away at our sanity, replacing our previous bravado with crippling terror. The air itself seemed to grow colder, heavy with a presence that choked the breath from our lungs and chilled us to the bone. The whispers played with our fears, making us question our sanity and each other, feeding our terror to grow stronger. We were no longer just 5 friends exploring a derelict motel. We were 5 terrified souls trapped in a supernatural nightmare, the chilling realization dawning on us with each passing moment that our initial adventure had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The Blackwood curse was not a mere legend. It was a living, breathing entity determined to make us its next victims. The escalating terror threatened to consume us, our initial bravado replaced by a primal fear that gnawed at our very souls. The night was still young, and the horrors that awaited us were far beyond our wildest nightmares. Escape seemed increasingly unlikely, the growing dread tightening its grip with each passing moment. The supernatural forces were no longer hinting at their presence, their intentions were becoming frighteningly clear. The whispers intensified, no longer a subtle rustling, but a screaming chorus in our minds. They weren't sounds anymore. They were thoughts, insidious suggestions weaving themselves into the fabric of our sanity. Sarah was the first to truly break. The visions that had plagued her earlier now consumed her entirely. She shrieked, her eyes rolling back in her head, her body contorting into unnatural positions. Her words, when she spoke, were fragments of sentences, nonsensical ramblings about shadowed figures and burning eyes, about a voice that promised oblivion. Her screams echoed through the motel, a chilling counterpoint to the whispers that gnawed at our minds. Mark, our staunch skeptic, was the next to falter. His attempts at rational explanations, once confident and unwavering, now dripped with a desperate tremor. He'd tried to dismiss the escalating events as tricks of the light, hallucinations brought on by stress and fatigue, but his voice lacked conviction, a thin veneer barely masking the terror that mirrored our own. He'd started clutching his trusty knife, his eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow, his hand shaking as he gripped the cold steel. He'd begun muttering to himself, trying to hold on to the rational explanations, but his words were getting increasingly incoherent. The logical constructs of his world, which had once served as a solid foundation, began to crumble. Emily, usually the quietest of the group, withdrew into herself entirely. She became a pale, silent ghost, her eyes wide and unfocused, her movements slow and deliberate. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't meet our gaze, her face a mask of terror that was far more disturbing than Sarah's frenzied outbursts. Her silence was more frightening than any scream, a stark testament to the overwhelming horror that had silenced her voice. She merely watched, observing everything in a hushed, horrified silence, a living testament to the insidious fear slowly consuming us all. Even Ben, initially the bravest of us, showed signs of cracking. The unwavering beam of his flashlight trembled, the light wavered and danced, reflecting his internal turmoil. His calm demeanor was replaced by a jittery anxiety, his voice a mere rasp as he tried to reassure us, his words failing him in the face of the relentless attacks on our sanity. The initial bravado that brought us together was crumbling, replaced by a suffocating blanket of fear. The paranoia, fueled by the relentless assaults on our senses and the descent into madness of our friends, began to fester amongst us. We started to eye each other with suspicion, each shadow cast by the weak light of Ben's flashlight becoming a potential threat. Each whisper felt like a betrayal. The whispers seemed to amplify our fears, feeding on our doubts, whispering insidious suggestions into our minds, turning our collective fear into a weapon of mutual distrust. We questioned whether our friends were succumbing to the curse or if they were becoming part of it, actively turning against us. One chilling incident vividly illustrated our growing descent into madness. Mark, in a moment of terrified clarity, accused Ben of planting false evidence, believing that he was colluding with the forces at work within the motel. His voice, ragged and desperate, was dripping with paranoia. He accused Ben of deliberately moving objects, of creating the illusions, of manipulating our fears. Ben, his own fear evident in his shaking hands and haunted eyes, vehemently denied the accusations. His protests, however, were unconvincing, as even he was beginning to question his own actions and perceptions. This was not a fair fight. The motel itself seemed to contribute to our unraveling. The flickering lights danced in grotesque patterns. The shadows writhed and shifted, playing tricks on our eyes, reinforcing the paranoia that grew between us. The temperature fluctuated erratically, switching between a stifling heat and an icy chill, further amplifying our discomfort and contributing to our fraying nerves. The whispers changed their tone. They were no longer simply taunts and warnings. They were now commands, suggestions of actions that seemed to emanate from our own subconscious. We found ourselves acting on impulses we didn't understand, drawn to specific areas of the motel, compelled to perform actions that directly opposed our own will and common sense. This subtle manipulation of our actions deepened our fears and only fueled the rising tide of chaos around us. It was as if the very fabric of the motel was working in concert with the whispers, accelerating our descent into the abyss of madness. Sarah became increasingly unpredictable, her pronouncements veering from incoherent ravings to chillingly accurate pronouncements. She would scream about the blood moon and the coming darkness, her words laced with an unsettling understanding of the forces at play. She seemed to be receiving messages from an entity beyond our comprehension, a perverse oracle of impending doom. Her insights felt like threats, premonitions, warnings that only deepened the mounting sense of dread that held us captive. Emily's silence deepened, her eyes constantly shifting, betraying a fear that was now bordering on psychosis. She seemed to be seeing things unseen, reacting to horrors invisible to the rest of us. Her silence was not merely the product of fear, but the sign of a mind shattering under the unrelenting psychological pressure. Her terrified silence was more eloquent than any scream, a testament to the horror that rendered her speechless. Mark's descent into paranoia was full-blown. He started to believe that the others, myself included, were part of the conspiracy. He would whisper accusations, his eyes darting around, perpetually searching for signs of betrayal. He began to suspect that we were all involved, working as pawns in some larger, terrifying design. His mind, once an anchor of rationality, had completely broken down under the crushing weight of the curse. The reality around us dissolved into a hallucinatory nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold an unseen menace. Every creak and groan sounded like a malicious whisper. The line between reality and delusion blurred as our fears amplified the strange occurrences and played tricks on our senses. The whispers in our minds, the shadowy figures at the periphery of our vision, the sudden temperature changes, these became less distinct events and more feelings, tangible manifestations of our deepest, darkest fears. The once strong bonds of friendship had disintegrated into a maelstrom of fear and suspicion. We were not only fighting for survival against an unseen enemy, we were fighting a relentless psychological battle against each other, as the Blackwood curse twisted our minds and pitted us against each other. We were becoming what we most feared, victims of our own minds. We were no longer simply trapped within the Blackwood Motel. We were trapped within our own minds, each of us alone in our own private hell. The night dragged on, the hours melting into an indistinguishable swamp of terror. The descent into madness was not gradual, but a terrifying freefall, an accelerated plummet into the darkest recesses of our minds. The Blackwood curse had broken us. It had claimed us not as victims of violence, but as victims of our own paranoia and fear, victims of our own minds. The end was inevitable. It was only a matter of time before we each gave way entirely, or perhaps we already had. The night dragged on, the hours melting into an indistinguishable swamp of terror. The descent into madness was not gradual, but a terrifying freefall, an accelerated plummet into the darkest recesses of our minds. The Blackwood curse had broken us. It had claimed us not as victims of violence, but as victims of our own paranoia and fear, victims of our own minds. The end was inevitable. It was only a matter of time before we each gave way entirely, or perhaps we already had. The whispers intensified, morphing into a cacophony of guttural hisses that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. My own heartbeat thrummed in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence of the motel. The air grew thick, heavy with a palpable sense of dread that choked the breath from my lungs. Then, a scream. It wasn't the frantic, high-pitched cry of Sarah's earlier breakdown, but a low, guttural scream that ripped through the air, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was Ben. I scrambled towards the sound, my heart hammering against my ribs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. The corridor twisted and turned, each shadowed corner a potential hiding place for whatever horrors lurked within the Blackwood Motel. The air grew colder, a biting chill that seeped into my bones despite the oppressive heat that had clung to us just moments before. The whispers intensified, now weaving themselves into the scream, a chorus of malice that seemed to guide me toward my doom. I rounded a bend, the beam of my flashlight illuminating a horrifying scene. Ben lay sprawled on the floor, his body contorted at an unnatural angle, his limbs twisted in ways they shouldn't have been. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the ceiling, their pupils dilated to black abysses that swallowed all light. His face, once strong and determined, was a mask of unimaginable terror, frozen in a rictus of silent screams. His chest didn't rise and fall. The air had been stolen from his lungs, replaced by a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. But it wasn't the stillness of death that chilled me to the bone. It was what had done this to him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, revealing a network of purple veins pulsing beneath the surface. His flesh, once firm, was now strangely soft, pliable, almost as though it were melting. The most disturbing aspect, though, was the absence of blood. There was no blood spatter, no wound that could explain the grotesque contortions of his body. He looked consumed, as if some unseen force had drained the life from him, leaving behind only a husk. A husk twisted and contorted into a grotesque mockery of life. A wave of nausea washed over me, the horrific image seared into my memory. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my stomach churning. The flashlight slipped from my trembling hand, plunging me into an even deeper darkness. The whispers intensified, mocking my fear, celebrating their victory. They surrounded me, a tide of malice threatening to engulf me entirely. Emily's reaction was immediate and shocking. The quiet terror that had haunted her until now exploded into a full-fledged panic. She didn't scream. She simply began to run, a frantic, stumbling dash down the corridor, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. I tried to call out to her, to stop her, but my voice caught in my throat, a strangled gasp lost in the suffocating silence of the motel. Mark, who had been slowly succumbing to paranoia and hallucinatory outbursts, stared at Ben's body with a vacant gaze. He didn't scream, he didn't cry. He simply repeated a single phrase over and over again, his voice a monotonous drone. He didn't see it coming, none of us did. His words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy of our impending doom. The rational skepticism he'd initially clung to had entirely evaporated, replaced by a numb acceptance of our impending fate. The silence that followed was the most terrifying silence I have ever experienced. It wasn't the empty silence of an abandoned building. It was a thick, suffocating silence imbued with a palpable malevolence. The whispers, still there, felt different, less like taunts and more like gloating. A growing fear began to fester within me, a fear that extended beyond the immediate horror of Ben's death. The whispers were not simply sounds. They were insinuating themselves into our minds, playing with our perceptions, and weaving insidious suggestions into the fabric of our thoughts. The motel itself seemed to be a conduit, a vessel for this evil, amplifying our fears and feeding off our terror. Each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of the lights, was a deliberate mockery, a torment designed to break us. The darkness pressed in on me, a physical entity that sought to crush me, to suffocate me. I fumbled for my flashlight, finding it, and desperately flicked the switch. The feeble beam struggled to pierce the darkness, creating a small circle of light that offered little comfort against the vast, menacing expanse of the night. I felt alone, more profoundly alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The fear was not only for my own life, but also for my sanity. I had to escape. I had to survive. I didn't know what had killed Ben, but I knew one thing: it wouldn't be long until it claimed another victim. Emily's desperate flight into the darkness had offered a glimpse of what it was like to confront the true terror within this forsaken motel, and I knew we were all in mortal peril. The events of the last few hours had shattered any sense of comfort or normalcy. The rational part of my mind struggled to grasp the reality of the situation, fighting against the overwhelming tide of fear and panic. This was no mere haunting. This was a malevolent force feeding off our terror, driving us to the brink of madness. The high-pitched screams from earlier echoed in my ears as my heart pounded against my ribs. The whispers were growing louder, weaving themselves into my own thoughts, suggesting actions, playing on my fears. My once solid grip on reality was loosening, the boundary between what was real and what was not growing hazy. I stumbled through the darkness, my breath hitching in my throat. My footsteps echoed in the silence of the corridor, each reverberation a reminder of my vulnerability. My flashlight cast long, dancing shadows that took on grotesque shapes, mocking my fear. It was a desperate, frenzied dash to escape, a race against time. I turned a corner, the light falling upon a broken mirror. My reflection stared back, its eyes wide with fear. I wondered if I was seeing myself, or another victim of this curse, another soul consumed by its malice. The feeling of being watched intensified, the darkness seemingly pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel it, a sinister presence, feeding on my fear, waiting to claim its next victim. And I knew with a terrifying certainty that it would be me. Or perhaps it already had, and I was merely a ghost, a phantom doomed to replay this horrific nightmare for eternity. The chilling sound of Emily's voice echoed through the motel. It was a choked gasp followed by silence. The whispers intensified, their chorus filled with a chilling triumph. It was a moment of agonizing recognition and the chilling confirmation that the Blackwood curse was far more powerful, more insidious, and far more lethal than I could have ever imagined. The relentless psychological siege had broken the fabric of reality, and I wasn't sure if I was running to survive or merely running from the fragments of my own shattered mind. The game had started, and I knew with an icy certainty that I was already losing. The silence pressed down on me, a physical weight crushing the air from my lungs. Emily's absence left a gaping hole in the darkness, a void that amplified the already overwhelming sense of isolation. It wasn't just the absence of her presence. It was the absence of any other sound, any other life, besides my own ragged breathing and the relentless, whispering malice that seemed to seep from the very foundations of the Blackwood Motel. The whispers, once a background hum, now filled the void, weaving themselves into the fabric of the silence, transforming it from a simple lack of sound into a living entity, a malevolent presence that coiled around me, constricting my breath, chilling me to the bone. They were no longer simple sounds. They were suggestions, insidious whispers that insinuated doubt, fear, and despair into my mind. They spoke of shadows that moved without form, of eyes that watched from unseen corners, of a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere at once. The darkness itself seemed to shift and breathe, the shadows stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like the approach of unseen feet. Every rustle in the dark felt like the brush of something cold and slimy against my skin. My own breath became a source of terror, each inhale a sharp reminder of my vulnerability, each exhale a slow release of life into the suffocating darkness. The feeling of being watched was relentless, a constant, icy pressure against my skin. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating only empty spaces, vacant rooms, and the grim, decaying surfaces of the Blackwood Motel. But the feeling persisted, the certainty that unseen eyes were fixed upon me, assessing me, judging me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My mind, already frayed by the horrors I had witnessed, began to play tricks on me. Shadows transformed into figures, the rustle of the wind became the whispers of unseen voices, and the creaking of the old building morphed into the groan of some monstrous entity awakening from its slumber. I wasn't sure what was real and what was a product of my own increasingly fractured sanity. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, leaving me adrift in a sea of terror, unable to discern friend from foe, sanity from madness. The isolation deepened the fear, amplifying every sound, every shadow, every whisper. Each passing moment felt like an eternity, each heartbeat a thunderous drumbeat against the oppressive silence. My flashlight beam became my only companion, a fragile shield against the overwhelming darkness, a feeble attempt to pierce the veil of the unknown. But even the light offered little comfort, its circle of illumination only serving to highlight the vast expanse of the terrifying unknown that surrounded me. I stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors of the motel, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, a constant reminder of my solitude. The darkness pressed in on me, a suffocating blanket that threatened to extinguish my last flickering embers of hope. My breath came in ragged gasps, each intake of air a desperate fight against the suffocating grip of fear. The whispers intensified, morphing into a chorus of guttural hisses that seemed to weave themselves into my very thoughts. They taunted me, mocked my fear, and whispered promises of oblivion. They suggested actions, whispered doubts, and planted seeds of despair in the fertile ground of my exhausted mind. The line between my own thoughts and the insidious suggestions of the malevolent entity blurred, leaving me uncertain of my own intentions, my own desires. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing my flashlight. I was plunged into absolute darkness, the silence now complete, broken only by the pounding of my own heart and the relentless whispers. Panic clawed at my throat, a desperate need for escape threatening to overwhelm me. I fumbled blindly in the darkness, my hands scraping against cold, rough walls, my fingers brushing against something slick and cold that sent shivers of revulsion down my spine. Then, in the absolute darkness, I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It started softly, almost imperceptible, a barely audible scraping against the walls. It grew louder, closer, more insistent, until it seemed to surround me, a chorus of scratching sounds that echoed through the empty hallways of the Blackwood Motel. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the relentless scratching. The darkness seemed to pulse, to breathe, to press in on me from all sides, closing in, squeezing the air from my lungs. The whispers intensified, intertwining with the scratching, forming a symphony of terror that threatened to drive me to the brink of madness. I was completely alone. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, driving home the sheer, terrifying magnitude of my isolation. There was no one to help me, no one to hear my screams, no one to witness my final moments. Only the darkness, the whispers, and the relentless scratching that echoed through the empty corridors of the Blackwood Motel. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound, a heavy blanket of nothingness that seemed to absorb all hope, all possibility of escape. It was a silence filled with the chilling certainty that something was near, something unseen, something waiting. My mind, struggling to comprehend the overwhelming terror, sought refuge in hallucination. I saw things in the darkness, fleeting glimpses of shadows, distorted figures that danced at the edge of my vision. I heard things, whispers that spoke my name, voices that promised salvation, and groans that hinted at unspeakable horrors. Yet, despite the relentless psychological assault, a flicker of defiance remained. A stubborn refusal to surrender to the darkness, to the whispers, to the isolation. A desperate clinging to the faintest thread of hope, the unwavering determination to survive. I had to escape. I had to find a way out of this nightmare, out of the suffocating grip of the Blackwood Motel. Because even in the face of unspeakable terror, the will to live remained, a fragile flame burning brightly in the heart of the darkness. But how long could it last? How long before the darkness extinguished that last spark of hope, leaving me utterly consumed? The question haunted me, a chilling echo in the terrifying silence of the Blackwood Motel. The answer, I feared, was closer than I thought. The whispers intensified, a chilling promise hanging in the air. My escape, if it were to happen at all, would have to be swift, decisive, and utterly desperate. My fingers brushed against something cold and slick again, this time closer, more defined. It felt like damp fabric, perhaps a tattered curtain or a piece of decaying upholstery. A sudden, desperate need to understand overwhelmed my fear. Ignoring the whispers, which now seemed to shriek my name, I reached out, my fingers tracing the outline of the object. It was a book, surprisingly intact amidst the ruin, bound in leather that felt disturbingly soft and supple beneath my fingertips. The cover was almost entirely gone, the remaining fragments hinting at an ornate design worn smooth by time and decay. With trembling hands, I pulled the book free from the wall where it seemed to have been tucked. The weight was surprisingly substantial. It felt thick and heavy, crammed with pages. My lighter, miraculously still functioning, flickered to life, casting a feeble light on the book's aged pages. The script was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a spidery, elegant hand interwoven with strange symbols and illustrations that sent a chill down my spine. It was a language I didn't recognize, yet somehow instinctively understood. The words spoke of rituals, sacrifices, and a malevolent entity bound to this cursed place. The book, a grimoire, I realized with a growing dread, detailed the history of the Blackwood Motel, revealing a truth far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. Generations ago, a coven of dark sorcerers had performed a ritual here, binding a powerful entity to the location. The entity, the grimoire explained, fed on fear and despair, drawing victims into its grasp to sustain itself. Its power grew with each death, each scream, each drop of blood spilled within the motel's decaying walls. The ritual, horrifyingly detailed, involved a complex series of sacrifices designed to appease the entity and maintain its imprisonment. The illustrations were the most disturbing part. They depicted grotesque scenes of human sacrifice, the victims contorted into unnatural positions, their faces twisted in silent screams. The entity itself was never directly depicted, but the aura of malevolent energy emanating from the illustrations was palpable, a cold dread that seeped from the pages and into my very soul. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, the images seared into my mind, a gruesome tapestry of terror that threatened to shatter my already fragile sanity. The words described the entity as a being of pure shadow, a malevolent force that thrived on negative emotions, and its imprisonment was tenuous, dependent on the continued performance of the ritual. As I read further, a cold realization settled upon me. The recent events, the disappearances, the chilling whispers, the terrifying encounters, they weren't random occurrences. They were part of a meticulously planned process, a grim ritual to appease the entity and strengthen its grip on the Blackwood Motel. Each of my friends, each scream I'd heard, each terrifying encounter had served as fuel for the entity's malevolent power. The entity wasn't just inhabiting the motel, it was feeding on our fear, using us as pawns in its horrifying game of survival. The grimoire revealed that the ritual wasn't a singular event, but a cyclical process. The entity required a regular sacrifice to maintain its bond to the motel, a horrifying feast of fear and despair. The failures of the past, reflected in the decaying state of the motel and the faded and almost indecipherable texts of the grimoire, were likely attempts to appease this entity. The very fact that the entity remained here despite those failures hinted at its vast power and almost indestructible nature. The thought sent a wave of icy terror through me. I was not just trapped in a haunted motel. I was caught in the midst of a centuries-old malevolent ritual. The realization was overwhelming, the weight of the information crushing me under its horrifying gravity. I was no longer just a terrified survivor. I was a key player in a macabre game of survival against a powerful entity. My friends were not merely victims of a haunted building. They were sacrifices, their deaths vital to the entity's continued existence. The grimoire's final pages revealed the process needed for the ritual's completion and the conditions that needed to be satisfied before it could be broken. It was a gruesome, intricate, and terrifying dance with death. The grim details chilled me to the bone. The ritual required a specific type of sacrifice, someone pure of heart, someone whose innocence and fear would amplify the entity's power. It needed a willing sacrifice, or one convinced into submission, to complete the cycle. And the book hinted that the current sacrifice had yet to be fully consumed, the ritual incomplete. The realization was horrifying. It implied that I wasn't yet safe, that I was, in some perverse way, still a potential offering, my very existence a tempting morsel for the insatiable hunger of the entity. A wave of nausea washed over me, my legs threatened to give way. I stumbled back, my hand still clutching the grimoire, its pages filled with horrifying illustrations and chilling details. The whispers intensified, morphing into a chorus of mocking laughter, their voices weaving themselves into my thoughts, suggesting actions, planting seeds of doubt and despair. They urged me to give in, to surrender to the inevitable. They promised oblivion, a sweet release from the crushing weight of my fear. But a spark of defiance flickered within me, a refusal to surrender. I had seen the horrors this place held, the entity's power. I understood the stakes, the catastrophic consequences of failure, but I would not be a sacrifice. I would not be another victim to fuel the entity's malevolent hunger. I would fight, even if my chances of success seemed slim to non-existent. Even if the odds were stacked against me, a grim and terrifying reality fueled by the knowledge contained in the grimoire, I would not give in. My resolve hardened, my fear transformed into a cold, steely determination. The grimoire offered not just terror, but also a glimmer of hope. The ancient text detailed not only the ritual's workings, but also potential ways to break it. It was a perilous path, fraught with danger, but it was the only chance I had. The final pages spoke of an ancient counter-ritual, a way to banish the entity back to the abyss from whence it came. The ritual was intricate, demanding precise actions and requiring specific artifacts, many of which were mentioned in the earlier sections of the grimoire. Finding them seemed like a Herculean task, given the state of the building, but it was a task I was determined to face. The path ahead was perilous. The darkness, the whispers, and the ever-present feeling of being watched remained constant, amplifying my fear. Yet, I held on to the grimoire, the ancient text my only guide through the labyrinth of terror. I had a plan. It was a slim chance, a desperate gamble, but it was my only hope. I had to find the artifacts detailed in the grimoire, perform the counter-ritual, and break the entity's hold on this cursed place. My survival, and perhaps the survival of countless others, depended on it. The grimoire described the artifacts with chilling detail, detailing their location and their purpose in the ritual. It spoke of a shattered mirror, a key hidden within a forgotten room, and a chalice stained with the blood of past sacrifices. Each item held a piece of the puzzle, each crucial to the success of the counter-ritual. The quest would be dangerous, requiring me to navigate the treacherous corridors of the Blackwood Motel once again, facing the entity's power head-on. But I had come too far to give up, seen too much to surrender. I would face the darkness, and I would fight for my life. The knowledge from the grimoire gave me a terrifying clarity, a chilling understanding of the true nature of my struggle. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight against a malevolent entity that had been feeding on fear and despair for centuries. It was a battle against a force that thrived on death and destruction, a force that had claimed the lives of my friends and countless others before them. The task before me was monumental, but I would not falter. The whispers continued, a constant reminder of the entity's presence, but they no longer held the same power. I had found purpose in my fear, a reason to fight, a reason to hope. I would escape, I would survive, and I would break the curse of the Blackwood Motel. The hunt for the artifacts began, a desperate race against time, a fight against an ancient evil that threatened to consume me entirely. My first attempt at escape was laughably naive. I chose the main entrance, the imposing rotting doors I'd initially entered through. The grimoire had mentioned something about the entity's power being strongest within the central structure of the motel, suggesting that escape routes further from the center held more promise. But the sheer terror of being trapped had overridden logic. I fumbled with the rusted doorknob, the metal cold and slick beneath my trembling fingers. It wouldn't budge, not a millimeter, as if some unseen force held it firmly in place. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like icy tendrils, mocking my futile efforts. Panic clawed at my throat, choking off my breaths. I pulled and pushed with all my might, my muscles straining, my lungs burning, but the door remained impassable, an unyielding barrier to my freedom. Finally, exhausted and defeated, I slumped to the ground, the cold, damp floor seeping into my clothes. The whispers turned to taunts, their voices blending into the creaking of the building, the moan of the wind, and the rustling of unseen things in the shadows. The feeling of being watched intensified, a palpable pressure bearing down on me, a crushing weight of dread. I was trapped, hopelessly, irrevocably trapped. The grimoire's words echoed in my mind. The entity's grip tightens with every failed escape. My second attempt was more calculated, guided by the grimoire's cryptic hints. The book described a service corridor, a hidden passage behind a loose panel in the dilapidated kitchen. Finding the kitchen was a nightmare in itself. Each step I took echoed through the desolate halls. Each shadow seemed to writhe and shift, as if the darkness itself was alive and malevolent. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet odor mingling with the coppery tang of old blood. I finally located the kitchen, a room consumed by darkness and the ghosts of meals long past. The loose panel, barely hanging on its rusted hinges, was easily spotted. Behind it, a narrow claustrophobic corridor smelling of mildew and dust. It was pitch black, the darkness absolute and complete, but I pressed forward, my hands tracing the cold, damp walls. The grimoire had warned about the corridor, speaking of shifting walls and illusions meant to disorient and trap the unwary. I moved slowly, carefully, my senses heightened, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The whispers were muted here, but something worse replaced them, a sense of being watched, of being surrounded by unseen eyes, an unnerving pressure that threatened to crush me. The passage seemed to twist and turn, defying logic and geometry, creating a disorienting maze of corridors. I felt walls shifting around me, the space itself seeming to warp and change, almost as if the corridor was alive. I fought the dizziness, clinging to the reality presented by the rough surfaces of the walls, ignoring the false paths and illusory turns. Just as I thought I might escape this labyrinth, the ground beneath me gave way. I tumbled into a gaping chasm, the fall seemingly endless, my body twisting and turning in the darkness. The air was ripped from my lungs, replaced by a terrifying silence, broken only by the distant whispers, which now felt close, right beside my ear, almost as though they were in my head. I landed with a sickening thud, my limbs aching, my head ringing. I was in another part of the basement, an area untouched by the previous exploration. The grimoire hadn't mentioned this chasm or this room, and I was beginning to think I was being driven mad. My third attempt involved the fire escape, a rusted, dilapidated metal structure clinging precariously to the side of the motel. Reaching it was a journey through increasingly unstable rooms, each filled with strange occurrences. In one room, I encountered moving furniture, chairs sliding across the floor as if pushed by an unseen hand. Then, a mirror shattered on the ground, each piece perfectly positioned, a strange, almost symmetrical pattern. In another, I found myself walking through a room filled with a thick, swirling fog, the air thick with a chilling cold that numbed my senses. The fog seemed to distort my perception, playing tricks on my mind, twisting the familiar layout of the motel into a confusing maze. The fire escape was even more perilous. The rusted metal groaned and creaked under my weight, threatening to collapse beneath me at any moment. Several steps were missing entirely, leaving gaping holes in the metal walkway. The climb was a test of my physical and mental strength, each step a gamble, each breath a challenge. The whispers intensified, filling my ears, mocking my struggle, yet simultaneously, a growing sense of urgency pushed me onwards. The closer I got to the roof, the more frantic the whispers became. As I neared the top, a sudden gust of wind threatened to tear me from my precarious position, almost throwing me from the escape. I clung to the railing, my knuckles white, my muscles screaming in protest. Just as I reached the roof, the ladder collapsed behind me, plummeting to the ground with a deafening crash. I was trapped on the roof, the wind howling around me, the night sky stretching endlessly above. I looked down, the ground a dizzying distance below. Escape seemed impossible once more. This was the entity's doing. It manipulated the environment, turning simple obstacles into deadly traps. It was as though the motel was a living entity itself, determined to keep me imprisoned within its decaying walls. The grimoire's chilling truth sunk in. My attempts were not merely thwarted. They were part of the ritual, fuel for the entity's power. My desperation, another sacrifice. The reality of my situation crashed down on me. I was not just fighting for my life. I was fighting against a force that manipulated space and time, that played with my perceptions, twisting my fears into impossible obstacles. The escape wasn't simply about finding a way out. It was about breaking the entity's grip on the motel. A task far more complex and terrifying than I had ever imagined. Each failure had strengthened its power, drawing me deeper into its grasp. But something within me remained unbroken, a stubborn ember of defiance refusing to be extinguished. The next attempt, I knew, wouldn't be about finding a mere exit. It would be about confronting the entity's power directly, a battle against the very fabric of the motel itself. The rooftop wind whipped around me, a tangible force threatening to tear me from my precarious perch. Below, the ground seemed miles away, a dizzying drop into the abyss. My previous escapes had been failures, each one a carefully orchestrated trap laid by the entity. The grimoire's words, once cryptic riddles, now held a chilling clarity. This wasn't about finding an exit, it was about confronting the entity itself. The thought sent a fresh wave of icy fear through me, yet a strange sense of resolve also took hold. I had to face this thing, whatever it was. Running was no longer an option. The air grew colder, the wind picking up to a howling gale. The shadows on the roof seemed to shift and writhe, taking on monstrous shapes in the flickering moonlight. I could feel the entity's presence, a palpable weight pressing down on me, a suffocating dread that threatened to crush the life from my lungs. It was close. I could almost feel its gaze upon me, a chilling scrutiny that pierced through my fear and into the very core of my being. Then it began. A low, guttural growl resonated from the depths of the motel, a sound that vibrated through the very structure of the building, shaking the ground beneath my feet. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a chorus of voices, mocking, taunting, urging me to surrender. But I refused. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms, ignoring the pain, focusing on the burning need to survive. The growl intensified, morphing into a chilling shriek that tore through the night, a sound both ancient and horrifying. The shadows coalesced, twisting and swirling into a vortex of darkness at the far end of the roof. From within this darkness, a shape began to emerge. It was tall and gaunt, its form shifting and uncertain, a creature of pure shadow and nightmare. Its features were indistinct, yet horrifyingly suggestive, hinting at features far too grotesque for human comprehension. Long, skeletal fingers reached out from the darkness, twitching and grasping, the mere sight of them sending a shiver of primal terror down my spine. The entity advanced, a slow, deliberate movement that was somehow both terrifying and mesmerizing. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating wave of pure malevolence that threatened to extinguish my will to live. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, a malevolent aura that seemed to drain the very life from me. I felt a strange paralysis seeping into my limbs, a chilling fear that threatened to freeze me in place. But the thought of my friends, their screams still echoing in my mind, spurred me on. I had to fight. I stumbled back, searching for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My eyes fell on a rusty pipe lying near the edge of the roof. Grasping it, I felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. This was it. This was my stand, my life against the darkness. The entity lunged, a blur of shadow and rage. I swung the pipe with all my might, connecting with a sickening thud against something solid yet strangely ethereal. The entity recoiled, a high-pitched scream tearing through the night, a sound that seemed to shatter the very fabric of reality. It staggered back, its form flickering and unstable. The darkness that had enveloped it seemed to recede, revealing glimpses of its true form, a horrific visage that made my blood run cold. It was a composite of nightmares, a tapestry woven from the darkest fears of humanity. But even as it recoiled, its power was immense. The ground beneath my feet began to shake, the entire motel vibrating with the entity's rage. The rusty pipe felt inadequate, a pathetic weapon against this ancient evil. I fought back, my movements desperate and frantic, a wild dance between life and death. The entity's attacks were relentless, each one a brutal assault, its presence suffocating, its power overwhelming. I fought with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed, driven by pure adrenaline and the burning need to survive. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, a terrifying dance of shadow and steel. The roof groaned under the strain, the structure creaking and threatening to collapse. With each swing of the pipe, I felt my strength waning, my body aching, my spirit frayed. But I refused to yield. I would not surrender to the darkness. Suddenly, I saw an opening, a weakness in the entity's form. It was a small, almost invisible point of light, a flicker within the darkness, a chink in its armor. I focused all my remaining strength into one final blow, swinging the pipe with everything I had left. The pipe connected with the point of light, sending a shockwave of energy surging through my body. The entity let out one final, agonizing shriek, a sound that echoed through the motel and into my soul. Then it vanished. The darkness receded, leaving only the wind and the stars. Silence descended, a heavy, oppressive silence, but one strangely free from the chilling dread. The fight had left me broken, my body aching, my spirit exhausted, but I had survived. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. I had broken the entity's hold on the Blackwood Motel, or so I thought. As I carefully made my way down the fire escape, my body trembling, I noticed something, a faint scratching at the base of the building, almost too quiet to hear, a slight movement in the shadows, my heart pounded against my ribs. I had won the battle, but perhaps the war was far from over. The whispers, though faint, still lingered, a reminder of the horrors I had faced, a chilling promise of what might yet come. The motel still stood, a silent testament to the darkness it held, a darkness I might never fully escape. The rusty pipe, still clutched in my trembling hand, felt strangely light, almost weightless. The adrenaline that had fueled my desperate fight was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. My legs, shaky and bruised, threatened to buckle beneath me. Each step down the fire escape was a victory, a testament to my will to survive, yet each creak of metal sent a fresh wave of icy fear through me. The ground loomed, a welcome sight, yet a terrifying reminder of my vulnerability. The shadows at the base of the motel seemed to writhe, shifting and reforming in the dim light, playing tricks on my eyes. My mind, still reeling from the battle, struggled to separate reality from the lingering effects of the entity's terrifying power. Was I truly free? Had I truly won? The question gnawed at me, a persistent doubt that contradicted the hard-won victory I felt. The silence, once a symbol of peace, now felt oppressive, heavy with a silent menace. The air, no longer charged with the entity's malevolent energy, felt strangely empty, void of the vitality that should have accompanied my survival. As I reached the ground, my feet sinking into the soft earth, I felt a tremor run through me, not from exhaustion, but from a primal instinct, a deep-seated warning. It wasn't the rumbling of the motel, but something subtler, something far more chilling. A faint scratching sound, barely audible above the wind, reached my ears. It emanated from the shadows near the base of the building, a sound that sent a fresh wave of icy fear crawling up my spine. I turned, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows at the base of the motel seemed to shift again, this time with a deliberate slowness that was far more unsettling than the chaotic movements I had witnessed before. A fleeting glimpse of movement, a hint of something dark and elongated, slithered through the gloom. It was just a suggestion, a fleeting image, yet enough to send a chill down my spine that no amount of adrenaline could counter. My instincts screamed at me to run, to escape this cursed place, yet a strange sense of morbid curiosity held me rooted to the spot. I wanted to believe that I had vanquished the entity, that I had broken its hold on the Blackwood Motel. But the scratching, the movement in the shadows whispered a different truth, a horrifying truth that gnawed at the edge of my consciousness. The battle was over, but the war, it seemed, was far from won. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for the rusty pipe, its cold metal a small comfort in the face of the growing dread. The shadows seemed to deepen, as if the very darkness was coalescing, gathering its strength, waiting. The wind picked up, swirling around me, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a murmur too low to understand, yet chillingly familiar. I backed away, my steps hesitant, my senses heightened. The scratching sound intensified, becoming a rhythmic scraping that echoed in the stillness of the night. My eyes darted back and forth, searching the shadows, desperately trying to penetrate the veil of darkness that concealed whatever lurked beneath. The faintest shimmer caught my eye, a movement at the edge of my vision, a glint of something dark and reflective snaking through the undergrowth. It was too quick to identify clearly, just a fleeting impression. My breath hitched in my throat. It seemed to move with a purposeful intent, a deliberate advance that instilled a terrifying certainty. I had not escaped the Blackwood Motel. I had only delayed the inevitable. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The sound of my own ragged breaths mingled with the wind, creating a symphony of fear. My muscles screamed in protest with each stride, but the terror propelled me forward, urging me to flee, to find safety, somewhere, anywhere, far from the sinister shadows of the Blackwood Motel. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, until the motel was nothing but a distant silhouette against the night sky. But even then, as I collapsed, gasping for breath, the feeling of being watched persisted. The whispers were faint, but they were still there, a subtle reminder of the horrors I had witnessed, a chilling echo of the evil that still lingered, waiting. The images flooded back, the grotesque forms, the chilling whispers, the suffocating dread. They clung to me like a shroud, a persistent reminder of the fight, the battle I thought I had won. But as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, a cold realization settled over me. The motel, with its secrets and its shadows, still held a part of me captive. The escape had been narrow, a sliver of chance in a maelstrom of terror. The victory was bittersweet, clouded by the undeniable knowledge that the entity's presence, its malevolent influence, remained a tangible threat. I had survived the immediate danger, but the war, I knew with a chilling certainty, was far from over. The whispers lingered, a haunting reminder of the horrors I had faced and the chilling uncertainty of what awaited me. The darkness had retreated, but not entirely. It was watching, waiting, biding its time. The Blackwood Motel still held its secrets, and a part of those secrets, a horrifying and indelible fragment, remained etched within my soul. Days turned into weeks, yet the chilling experience remained as vivid as if it had happened only moments ago. The memories haunted my dreams, each night a terrifying replay of the events. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the shadows to reach out, to grasp me again. Sleep offered no solace, only a fleeting respite from the gnawing fear that had taken root within me. I tried to find normalcy, to return to a life beyond the horrors I had witnessed. But the memories, the whispers, the lingering sense of dread were too powerful to ignore. The fear of darkness had become an inescapable shadow, a constant companion that would likely remain with me for the rest of my days. The escape had been narrow, a desperate flight from a nightmare that had refused to end. But as I looked back, I saw it not just as a narrow escape, but as a terrifying harbinger. The entity, while temporarily subdued, was not destroyed. The Blackwood Motel stood as a grim reminder, a dark monument to a horror I had only just begun to comprehend. The whispers in the dark were not silenced, merely muted, a haunting prelude to what the future might hold. The war was far from over, the darkness waited, patient and relentless. And I, its sole surviving witness, would forever bear the scars of the Blackwood Motel. The shadows still danced, and the whispers still lingered, waiting. The world outside the motel was a cacophony of sights and sounds that assaulted my already frayed nerves. The vibrant colors of the sunrise, usually a source of comfort, now felt jarring, almost hostile. The cheerful chirping of birds sounded like mocking laughter, and the gentle breeze felt like icy fingers tracing my skin. My escape had been a physical one, a desperate flight from the clutches of the Blackwood Motel, but my mind remained trapped, a prisoner in a cage of terror. The initial euphoria of survival gave way to a crushing wave of exhaustion, both physical and mental. My body ached, every muscle screaming in protest, each bruise a painful reminder of my ordeal. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional torment that gnawed at me. The vivid images of the night's events played on repeat in my mind, a macabre film reel running endlessly, showing the grotesque faces, the twisted forms, the blood and the screams. Sleep, once a refuge, now became a torment. Nightmares plagued me, each one a terrifying recreation of the horrors I had witnessed. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, gasping for air, the chilling whispers of the motel echoing in my ears. The fleeting moments of peace were shattered by flashbacks, sudden, jarring memories that would invade my waking hours, transforming mundane situations into terrifying recreations of the motel's gruesome interiors. A flickering light would trigger a memory of the shadows that had chased me through the corridors. A creaking door would bring back the chilling sounds of the entity's approach. Even the smell of rain on dry earth stirred up the overwhelming stench of decay that permeated the motel's air. Days bled into weeks, each one a monotonous repetition of the same cycle, waking to the shadow of fear, battling the nightmares, and desperately trying to push the memories down, only to find them resurfacing at the most unexpected moments. I tried to find normalcy, to return to the life I had before, but the task seemed impossible. Simple things, like walking down a darkened street or being alone in my apartment, triggered waves of panic, a suffocating reminder of my vulnerability. My friends, or rather, what remained of them in my mind, haunted me as well. Their faces, contorted in fear and pain, played in a horrifying loop in my memory. The vivid details of their deaths were inescapable, each death a horrifying masterpiece of terror. Guilt gnawed at me. Had I done enough? Could I have saved them? The questions haunted me, fueling a sense of helplessness that seemed as inescapable as the shadows that followed me. I sought help, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of my former self. The therapist listened, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil within me. She spoke of PTSD, of the long-term effects of trauma, of the need for healing. Her words were comforting, but they did little to alleviate the pain that gnawed at my soul. The sessions were exhausting, each one a painful excavation of my memories, each revelation another blow to my already fragile psyche. The medications she prescribed helped to regulate the overwhelming waves of anxiety and panic, but the nightmares persisted, relentless, unyielding. They were a constant reminder of the darkness I had faced, a terrifying testament to the depths of the evil that had dwelled within the Blackwood Motel. I tried to find solace in the daylight, seeking comfort in the company of others, but even the presence of loved ones couldn't fully silence the whispers of the night. One day, while going through old photographs, I found a picture of myself and my friends, taken just before our fateful trip to the Blackwood Motel. Their faces, alive and vibrant in the photograph, were a stark contrast to the memories of their terrified expressions etched in my mind. The image sparked a bittersweet wave of grief and longing. Their laughter, their joy, these were memories that the motel could never take from me, yet the pain of their loss was ever present, a heavy weight in my heart. Despite the therapy, the medication, and the support of my loved ones, I knew that the scars of the Blackwood Motel would stay with me forever. The trauma would linger, a persistent reminder of the night that irrevocably changed my life. The fear, though lessened by time and treatment, was never truly gone. The shadows still danced in the periphery of my vision, a constant reminder of the lurking danger. I learned to live with the trauma, to navigate the labyrinth of my memories and the lingering fear. I learned to manage the panic attacks, to control the flashbacks, to quiet the persistent whispers. It was a slow, arduous process, filled with setbacks and moments of intense anguish. But with each small victory, with each moment of peace, I found a sliver of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest night, the dawn eventually breaks. The Blackwood Motel remained a dark chapter in my life, a horrifying tale I would never forget, but it was not my entire story. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, survival is possible. The whispers still lingered, faint echoes of a nightmare that would always be a part of me. But they were quieter now, subdued by time and healing. The shadows still danced, but I had learned to stand in the light, and that was a victory in itself. I would carry the scars, but I would not be defined by them. I would live and I would remember, but I would also move forward, seeking solace and strength in the memories of those I had lost and the love of those who remained. The war was over, but the battles continued, fought not on the battleground of a cursed motel, but within the chambers of my own heart. And in those chambers, slowly but surely, peace began to grow. The sense of unease began subtly, a prickling at the edges of my awareness, like the faintest whisper on the wind. It wasn't a full-blown panic attack, not the gut-wrenching terror that had become so familiar in the weeks following my escape from the Blackwood Motel. Instead, it was a low hum of disquiet, a constant nagging feeling that I was being watched. It started with small things. A flickering light bulb in my apartment, seemingly without reason. The sudden chill in the air, even on a summer's day, leaving goosebumps on my skin despite the warmth of my surroundings. Objects shifting inexplicably, a book falling from the shelf, a pen rolling across the desk, seemingly propelled by an unseen hand. Initially, I dismissed them as coincidences, the product of an overactive imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma I had endured. But the incidents became increasingly frequent, increasingly unsettling. The feeling of being watched intensified. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that flickered and vanished before I could focus on them. The rustling of fabric, the creak of floorboards, the faintest whisper of a name I couldn't quite place. All these sounds emerged from the silence, seemingly orchestrated to keep me in a state of perpetual unease. Sleep offered no refuge. The nightmares continued, even more vivid, more terrifying than before, now infused with a sense of pursuit, a feeling of inescapable dread. I was no longer simply reliving the events at the motel. I was being actively hunted in my dreams, the shadowy figure from my nightmares gaining a terrifying sense of realism. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, a sudden crash from the next room sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. My heart hammered in my chest as I cautiously approached the source of the noise. The living room was in disarray. Furniture had been overturned, pictures lay shattered on the floor, and a heavy bookshelf had been pulled from the wall, leaving a deep gouge in the plaster. There was no sign of forced entry, no explanation for the chaos. The air hung heavy with the same cloying, sickeningly sweet scent of decay that had permeated the Blackwood Motel. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. It was the unmistakable smell of death. The police investigation yielded nothing. They concluded it was a break-in, despite the lack of stolen items or signs of forced entry. Their skepticism, their inability to grasp the reality of what I had experienced, only intensified my growing sense of isolation and dread. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. The therapist suggested it was a manifestation of my trauma, a coping mechanism born from the fear and anxiety that were consuming me. But a part of me knew, deep down, that something far more sinister was at play. The feeling of being watched intensified further. I began to see patterns in the strange occurrences. They always seemed to happen when I was alone, usually at night, always preceded by a subtle shift in the air, a change in the temperature, a prickling at the back of my neck. It was as if the entity was testing me, probing my defenses, pushing me to the brink of sanity. One night I awoke to a cold dread. The room was plunged into darkness, the electricity having inexplicably failed. The air was thick with a palpable sense of evil. A whisper, chillingly close, sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like the breath of something cold and dead upon my neck. I felt a presence at the foot of my bed, a heavy weight that pressed down on me, stealing my breath, freezing the blood in my veins. The darkness pulsed with a malevolent energy, its essence so tangible it felt like a living thing. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting back the wave of terror that threatened to overwhelm me. Then a cold touch brushed against my hand, icy and clammy. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. I opened my eyes, ready to confront whatever was there, but the room was empty. The only evidence of the intrusion was the lingering cold and the chilling whisper, now echoing softly in my ears, playing the tune of fear again and again until dawn broke. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the shadows, listening for any unusual sound. I tried to rationalize the events, to find logical explanations, but the evidence contradicted every explanation. My once peaceful apartment felt like a haunted house, the walls whispering secrets, the shadows dancing mockingly in my peripheral vision. Sleep became impossible, the nightmares unrelenting, each one more terrifying than the last. In these dreams, I was no longer just a witness to the horrors of the Blackwood Motel. I was actively hunted, the shadowy figure from the motel appearing everywhere I went, its presence a constant reminder that the evil I had faced was far from gone. I started to notice similarities between the strange occurrences in my apartment and the events that had unfolded in the motel. The same unsettling cold, the same peculiar sense, the same feeling of being watched. It was as if the evil that had haunted the motel had followed me home, was still somehow attached to me. The terror was no longer contained within the rotting walls of that derelict building. It was following me, insinuating itself into my life, turning my sanctuary into a place of dread. The feeling of dread consumed me, a constant companion that followed me from dawn till dusk. Each shadow was a phantom, every creak in the floorboards a portent of doom. Even the mundane activities of everyday life were now fraught with terror, every corner of my world seemingly harboring the unseen presence that threatened to claim me as its next victim. I was trapped in a nightmare that was far from over, a nightmare that had only just begun. The feeling of being watched, once a faint whisper, had now become a deafening roar, a haunting echo of the horrors I had experienced, a terrifying symphony of impending doom. I was no longer running from the Blackwood Motel. I was running from the darkness itself, a darkness that had somehow become an inseparable part of me. And this nightmarish chase was far from its end. The police, as expected, were unhelpful. Their cursory investigation, a mere formality rather than a genuine effort to understand, concluded with a shrug and a muttered something about a possible break-in, despite the lack of any stolen possessions or evidence of forced entry. The dismissive tone, the barely concealed skepticism in the officer's eyes felt like a fresh wound, a brutal reminder of my isolation. No one believed me, not really. They saw a traumatized woman, a victim of her own overactive imagination, a casualty of the horrors she'd witnessed at the Blackwood Motel, rather than a survivor desperately clinging to sanity in the face of a malevolent force that refused to let go. My therapist, Dr. Albright, a kind woman with weary eyes that spoke of countless stories of human suffering, was more understanding but no less ultimately unconvinced. She listened patiently, her face a mask of professional neutrality as I recounted the escalating events, the inexplicable occurrences in my apartment, the chilling whispers, the tangible sense of dread, the icy touch in the darkness. She spoke of PTSD, of the mind's remarkable ability to create elaborate defense mechanisms in the face of unbearable trauma. She prescribed medication, suggested therapy sessions, offered words of comfort and encouragement, but her explanations felt inadequate, insufficient to address the chilling reality that I was living. The medication helped marginally. It dulled the sharp edges of my anxiety, eased the constant thrum of fear that vibrated beneath my skin, but it couldn't erase the underlying dread, the persistent feeling of being watched, of being hunted. The therapy sessions, while providing a space to vent my fears, did little to alleviate them. Dr. Albright's gentle probing into my past, her attempts to link my current experiences to childhood trauma, felt sterile, academic, detached from the palpable terror that clung to me like a shroud. The loneliness intensified. My friends, initially supportive, gradually distanced themselves. Their concern waned, replaced by an uncomfortable awkwardness, a hesitancy to engage with my increasingly erratic behavior. Their pitying glances, their hushed conversations felt like a constant judgment, a silent condemnation of my sanity. I tried to explain, to share my experiences, but their polite dismissiveness, their gradual withdrawal, only served to deepen my sense of isolation. I was alone, adrift in a sea of disbelief, haunted by an unseen terror that no one else could comprehend, a fear that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I began to document everything. Each strange occurrence, each unsettling whisper, every inexplicable event was meticulously recorded in a thick, leather-bound journal. The act of writing, the tangible expression of my fear, offered a semblance of control, a way to wrestle with the chaos consuming my life. The journal became my confidant, my silent witness, the only entity that truly understood the horrors I was enduring. Its pages filled with frantic scrawls, rushed descriptions, and shaky drawings, mirroring the chaotic turmoil within me. The shadows grew bolder, the whispers louder. The cold touch became more frequent, more invasive, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that stalked my every move. Objects moved more aggressively now, crashing to the floor with violent force. The air grew heavy, the scent of decay, that sickeningly sweet smell, a constant and oppressive presence in my apartment. Sleep became a brief respite from the horror, offering only fleeting moments of escape from the nightmares that pursued me even in my unconscious state. I started avoiding mirrors. The reflection staring back at me, gaunt, haunted, with dark circles under eyes that hadn't seen a proper night's sleep in weeks, was a stranger. It wasn't just the physical toll. The reflection seemed to carry the same chilling pallor, the same sense of dread that had enveloped me. It felt like looking into the eyes of the darkness itself. One night, amidst the unrelenting terror, the whispered threats, and the incessant feeling of being watched, a terrible realization dawned on me. The darkness, the evil that had pursued me from the Blackwood Motel, wasn't simply a manifestation of my trauma, a byproduct of my damaged psyche. It was something real, something tangible, something malevolent. The disbelief, the skepticism, the pitying glances, they were not an attempt to understand but a testament to the nature of my torment. No one believed me because they couldn't. They couldn't because they couldn't see what I saw, couldn't feel what I felt. They couldn't because it existed outside their perception, a horror only I could perceive, only I could experience. The terrifying truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was utterly alone in my fight against this unseen evil. I was trapped in a nightmare, and no one could save me. My fight was my own, a battle against an overwhelming force, a battle for sanity, a battle for survival. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The weight of expectation, the burden of seeking external validation, vanished. My survival now depended solely on me, on my strength, on my ability to confront the darkness head-on. The chilling truth was far more terrifying than any supernatural event. The terror that was stalking me was not the unknown, but the isolation of an unfathomable horror, a horror that could not be shared, only endured. The fight was far from over. The darkness continued its insidious advance, its presence a constant, chilling reminder of the horrors I faced. But a new resolve hardened within me, a cold steel determination. I would no longer cower in fear. I would confront the darkness, even if it meant facing it utterly alone. The shadow lurking at the edges of my world was not just a nightmare, it was my reality now, and I would fight for it. I would fight for my sanity, for my life, I would fight for my own survival, and I would fight it alone. The chilling realization that this was my burden to bear, my terrifying, isolated burden, solidified my resolve. The fight for my life and my sanity had just begun. The loneliness and fear were no longer just emotions. They were weapons, sharpening my senses, making me more vigilant and more determined. This new reality was terrifying, yes, but it was also, in a strangely perverse way, empowering. I was alone, yes, but I was also free. Free from the shackles of expectation, free from the burden of seeking validation, free to fight with everything I had, and fight I would. The fight for my life, my sanity, my very soul. It was a lonely fight, but it was my fight, and I would not lose. The chipped paint on my windowsill seemed to writhe, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes, distorting the familiar shapes into grotesque parodies. It was a subtle shift, barely perceptible, yet it sent a fresh wave of icy dread through me. This wasn't just my imagination anymore. This wasn't PTSD manifesting as hallucinations. This was something else, something watching. I tried to rationalize it. The old building settled, the paint cracked under the relentless assault of the elements. The shadows danced in the flickering gaslight, playing tricks on the weary eyes of a sleep-deprived woman. But the rational explanations felt hollow, weak, easily shattered by the chilling certainty that I wasn't alone. The entity's presence was a constant, insidious pressure, a weight on my chest, a chilling whisper in the back of my mind. It was in the subtle shifts in temperature, a sudden chill that would prickle my skin despite the summer heat. It was in the unsettling stillness, the unnerving silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock that seemed to mock the passage of time. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than any shriek. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were plagued by visions of the Blackwood Motel, distorted and nightmarish. The corridors twisted and turned, the rooms shifting and changing shape, the faces of my friends contorted into expressions of unspeakable agony. I would wake with a gasp, my heart pounding like a frantic drum, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to me like a shroud. The line between dream and reality blurred, the world around me constantly shifting and changing, never quite feeling safe, never feeling real. I tried to establish a routine, to regain a sense of normalcy. I cleaned my apartment, meticulously organizing every item, attempting to tame the chaos that seemed to have taken root within my walls. I forced myself to eat, to shower, to even venture outside, although venturing outside felt like navigating a minefield of unseen dangers, a place where the unseen entity could pounce. Each step felt like a calculated gamble. But the entity thwarted my attempts to regain control. Objects would shift, inexplicably changing position, a book falling from a shelf, a photograph turning face down, a chair slightly askew. It wasn't a storm, a draft, or a clumsy movement. It was deliberate, calculated, designed to unsettle. It was a cruel game of cat and mouse, the entity playing with me, toying with my sanity. Then came the whispers, at first faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in a distant wind, but they grew bolder, closer, more insistent. They were not words, not phrases, but sounds, rasping, guttural, designed to evoke a sense of primal dread. They slithered into my ears, filling the spaces between the beating of my heart. A constant, relentless reminder of the entity's presence. The whispers would start softly, like the wind whistling through broken glass. They would intensify, growing louder. more menacing, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with their malevolent energy. They would morph into distorted echoes of my own thoughts, twisting my words, mocking my fears. They echoed with the sounds of things I had seen, things I had heard in the motel, the screams, the crashing of glass, the dragging of feet across cold tiles. I tried to fight back. I turned on the lights, blasting the darkness with their harsh glare. I played loud music, trying to drown out the whispers, the unsettling silences that always seemed to follow. But the entity was relentless, its influence pervasive, its control seemingly absolute. The music only seemed to amplify the chilling whispers, the lights only highlighted the shifting shadows, revealing monstrous shapes where none should be. The air in my apartment grew heavy, thick with the suffocating scent of decay, that sickeningly sweet smell that I now recognized as the harbinger of the entity's presence. It was the smell of death, of something ancient and malevolent. It clung to me, saturating my clothes, my hair, my skin, a constant reminder of the horrors that had befallen me. It was not just an odor, it felt like a sentient entity wrapping its vile tendrils around me, choking the life out of me. One morning I woke to find a single, withered black rose on my pillow. It was perfectly formed, yet its petals were brittle, dusty, as though centuries old. It emanated an aura of decay, a silent testament to the relentless power of the entity. Its presence on my pillow seemed like a threat, a morbid promise, a symbol of the entity's unwavering influence. The feeling of being watched intensified. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and penetrating. Even when the room was empty, even when I was alone, it felt like something vast and ancient was studying me, assessing my weaknesses, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. I spent days in a perpetual state of apprehension, constantly jumping at shadows, my ears straining for the slightest whisper, every sense heightened to a point of unbearable tension. My attempts to reach out for help were met with the same dismissive responses as before. I was a broken record, my increasingly desperate pleas falling on deaf ears. The doctors, the therapists, my remaining friends, they saw only a woman unraveling, a victim of her own mind, not the victim of something far more sinister. My pleas felt as hollow as my rationalizations. The only difference was their increased urgency. This wasn't a battle against my own trauma, it was a battle against an ancient and malevolent force. The trauma was the opening, the vulnerability that allowed the entity to creep into my world, to ensnare me in its malevolent grip. Escaping this was more than just overcoming PTSD, it was about escaping a supernatural prison. The entity's influence wasn't merely psychological, it was physical, tangible. It was in the way the shadows deepened, the way the temperature plummeted, the way the whispers intensified, the unsettling way objects would shift. My fight for survival had become a desperate game of wills, a battle against an unseen enemy that held complete control over my reality. Every day, every moment was an act of defiance, a desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control, to resist its insidious influence. The fight for my sanity, and indeed my very existence, continued, each day a battle fought on the precipice of despair, a lonely struggle against an unseen, unimaginable horror. The fight was not simply physical, it was a fight against the erosion of my sanity. The slow, insidious creep of despair, the entity played on my fears, my vulnerabilities, pushing me to the very edge of madness. But even as the darkness closed in, a spark of defiance remained, a stubborn refusal to surrender, a ferocious will to survive. I would fight, I would resist, I would survive. The withered black rose lay on my pillow, a macabre memento mori. Its scent, a cloying sweetness mixed with the unmistakable stench of decay, clung to the air, a suffocating presence that mirrored the growing dread in my heart. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Each night, the nightmares intensified, the visions of the Blackwood Motel morphing into grotesque parodies of reality. The faces of my friends, twisted in silent screams, haunted my dreams, their vacant eyes following my every move, even in waking hours. I tried to focus on the mundane, the ordinary. I cleaned. I cooked, I forced myself to engage in the rituals of daily life, seeking solace in the familiar, but even the most mundane tasks felt tainted, corrupted by the entity's insidious influence. A misplaced spoon, a flickering light bulb, the sudden chill that would grip me despite the summer heat, each seemingly insignificant occurrence amplified my growing fear, a constant reminder that I was not alone, that I was being watched, studied, manipulated. The whispers persisted, growing more insistent, more personal. They weren't simply the sounds of decay and death anymore. They were voices, mocking me, taunting me, whispering secrets about my deepest fears. They echoed the screams of my friends, the sounds of their final moments, a symphony of terror that played on a loop in my tormented mind. I tried to silence them with music, with television, with the incessant chatter of daytime television, but the whispers cut through the noise, always present, always lurking just beneath the surface. One day, I found a collection of old photographs scattered across my living room floor. They weren't my photographs. They were pictures of the Blackwood Motel, pictures I had never seen before. They depicted scenes from the motel's past, scenes of laughter and merriment, of families vacationing, of couples on romantic getaways. But overlaid on these images were subtle distortions, a blurring of the edges, a sense of unease that crept into the otherwise happy scenes. It was as if the entity was trying to show me its history, its power, its enduring presence, stretching back through the years, a chilling testament to its timeless malevolence. I felt a profound sense of dread, the chilling realization that the motel's history was not merely a story, it was a living, breathing entity, and I was now irrevocably entangled in its macabre narrative. The entity's power seemed to grow with each passing day. The subtle shifts in my apartment escalated into full-blown manifestations. Furniture moved, objects disappeared and reappeared in unexpected places, and the shadows danced with a disturbing intelligence. The air grew heavy with that sickening scent of decay, the odor intensifying until it choked me, a physical manifestation of the entity's power. I began to suspect that the whispers were not merely auditory hallucinations. They were a form of communication, a way for the entity to influence my thoughts, my actions, my very essence. I tried to fight back, to regain control of my reality. I performed cleansing rituals, attempting to banish the entity with prayer, with sage, with anything I could find to combat the growing darkness that had consumed my life. I sought help, reaching out to anyone who would listen, desperately trying to convince them of the truth, of the unspeakable horror that haunted my every waking moment, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. My increasingly frantic descriptions dismissed as the ravings of a troubled mind. I was alone, utterly and completely alone, trapped in a fight against an entity that seemed to hold sway over my reality, its grasp tightening with every passing second. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. My apartment became a prison, the walls closing in on me, the shadows deepening, the whispers intensifying, until I was living in a perpetual state of fear, my only solace in the fading embers of hope. The entity seemed to anticipate my every move, to know my every fear. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the game was rigged. I was playing against an opponent that held all the cards, an opponent with a centuries-old history of terror and manipulation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across my apartment, I felt a profound sense of surrender. The relentless assault on my senses, the constant terror, the isolation, the despair. It was too much. I sank to my knees, accepting the inevitable, allowing the darkness to engulf me, to consume me entirely. Then something shifted. A faint glimmer of hope, a spark of defiance rekindled within me. It wasn't a rational thought, it was an instinct, a primal urge to survive. I refused to yield. I refused to succumb to the entity's power. I would fight to the bitter end, even if it meant facing unimaginable horrors. This new resolve did not change the reality of the entity's presence. The whispers continued, the shadows danced, the objects moved, but my fear, though still palpable, was tempered with a steely resolve. The entity's power remained, it was undeniable, but so did my own will to resist. It was a battle of wills, a struggle for survival, a fight to reclaim my own reality from the grasp of an ancient, malevolent force. The fight continues. Even as I write this, I can feel the entity's presence. A cold, unsettling weight on my chest, a shadow lurking in the corners of my vision. The whispers are softer now, but they are still there, a constant reminder that my ordeal is far from over. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape the Blackwood Motel, if I will ever truly be free from the entity's influence. But I know this. I will fight. I will resist. I will survive. And perhaps, one day, I will find a way to break free from the lingering shadow of the Blackwood Motel, a shadow that stretches far beyond the confines of that decaying building and into the very fabric of my existence. The battle is far from over. The lingering shadow of the Blackwood Motel remains a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that dwells within the ordinary, the unseen horrors that can seep into our lives and claim us as their own. The ending is uncertain, the future bleak, but the fight continues, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the indomitable will to live, even in the face of unimaginable terror. The horror may linger, but so does the hope, a flicker in the encroaching darkness, a testament to the enduring power of survival.